Example number 5 continued, right? So we're still talking about pre-wrath Christians. Example number 5 continued. Like mid-tribbers, we pre-wrathers make a dramatic distinction between events in the first half of the 7 years and events in the second half of the 7 years. Are you following along? 7 years, 3.5 and 3.5. And yet, we find it particularly critical to eschatological discussions to disambiguate the differing uses of the popular English term tribulation, which is kind of what I'm doing now. When we pre-tribbers, we pre-wrathers, wow, that was a faux pas. We pre-wrathers, when we talk about tribulation, we right away start distancing ourselves from the classic pre-trib use of the word tribulation. If you watch any of Marvin Rosenthal's teachings, where he's giving these classes to students and explaining the pre-wrath position. Remember, Marvin Rosenthal is the son of the late, David Rosenthal is the son of the late Marvin Rosenthal. So Marv is the dad and David is the son. And Zion's Hope is the name of the ministry that David heads up. So David picked up the mantle from Papa Marv, and Marv wrote the book, and I'll flash a picture of this and post on the screen, the Prewrath Rapture of the Church. And in that book, he part of an opening, initiating kind of logic that he starts using is disambiguating the terminology, similar to what I'm doing right now. And so if you watch any of David Rosenthal's teachings, one of the first things he comes out of the gate with is the Bible never calls the 70th week of Daniel the 7-year tribulation. Okay? So it's a big point that he tries to drive home, is that the 70th week of Daniel is never labeled, the entire 7 years is never labeled the tribulation. Nowhere in the Bible. Rather, what Jesus does do is he tells us that there will be tribulation, and then he starts kind of isolating it to a certain part of that 70th week. He first talks about the beginning of birth pangs. We can find this in Matthew, by the way, Matthew 24. Jesus first talks about this beginning of birth pangs, or the what we call the birth pangs, or the beginning of sorrows in some translations. Beginning of sorrows, beginning of birth pangs. I think the Greek favors the birth pangs language, but some translations use the nuance sorrows. So this is a time period that's describing the first half of the 70th week. And let me show you the slide so it's easier for you to follow along. Give me a moment. I'm going to do this version for a split second, because it's easier for me to jump straight. Is that the one? Yeah, that's the one I want. Okay, so looking at, oops, why did it jump there? Sorry. Did something I didn't want it to do. Oh well, I'll just back up and do it this way. All right, pre-wrath. Notice that we have beginning of sorrows in the first 3.5 years. And then we have the midpoint, and then we have a section known as Great Tribulation, and then after that, a section known as Day of the Lord. And so going back over to this slide, we pre-wrathers, we make a point of finding it particularly critical to differentiate and be very precise when we're talking about tribulation. And we have even been taken to task by other positions who say, how can you be that precise? And our answer is, well, in the book of Matthew, chapter 24, in Yeshua's Olivet Discourse, not just Matthew, but it's in Mark and Luke as well, but the Olivet Discourse passages seem to have Jesus telling his disciples that part of this tribulation period, if you want to call it a tribulation period, I'm okay with that. I think I can be on board with that. But part of this 7-year period is what I'd preferred you to refer to it as, instead of calling it a tribulation period. But part of this 7-year period will be earmarked by something that Jesus labels specifically. These are birth pangs. These are these will be the beginnings of sorrows. And so I want you to see this specifically, because it is very important. It's right here in verse 8 of Matthew's version. But all of these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. And then in verse 9, he backs up and begins to, in verse 9, he begins to create a transition to let us know that something dramatic takes place. Then they will hand you over to tribulation and kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations. And at the time, verse 10, many will fall away, and they'll betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will rise up and mislead many people. And because of lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end, that one will be saved. And then he talks about the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So it seems to be describing what I say from verse 9 to verse 14 as the second half of the 70th week, because he said earlier in verse 8, but all these things, meaning by contrast, the things to follow, are not merely the beginnings of birth pangs, because the transition of verse 9 with then seems to support that particular position. And then to make it certain, when he gets down to verse 15, he backs up to the midpoint of the week again, right? From verse 14, he said, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations in the end. So he walks us all the way to the end of the week, from the midpoint starting in verse 9 to the end in verse 14, because he talks about the end in verse 13, he talks about the end of verse 14. So this lets me know that he's kind of doing this broad overview for a moment from verse 9 to verse 14. But then he backs up, he recapitulates like the book of Revelation does. He backs up in verse 15 to the midpoint of the week, because he needs both the disciples as well as us to understand that there will be this very significant event that takes place at the midpoint that we can watch for and that we need to be prepared for in advance. And so he starts out now by saying, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation that's spoken of to Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. That's at that point when he now starts detailing more events. He zooms in. He goes back to the midpoint and he zooms in to let us know that now there's going to be, let me find it. Let me scroll down. In verse 21, for then there will be a great tribulation. And he distinguishes saying great tribulation from earlier, where he just kind of talks about they'll hand you over to tribulation. But even verse 9 is still within the midpoint of the week. So even 9 there is great tribulation, but he doesn't use the word great. But we now have him saying great in verse 21, and then he gives more descriptions of this great tribulation. He talks about how that the days will be so intense that all elect would be killed if it wasn't for a cutting short of that great tribulation. And then I like the context of verse 22 is framed within verse 21 when he talks about those days. Those days in the Greek has like two words connected to one word for the days. That lets us know that it's actually a definite article in front of the word those. It's actually hyper literally in Greek. It's and if those days. Right, or the days, or something like that. It's really he's really kind of focusing in on that. It's referring to, I believe, the immediate context of the days of the Great Tribulation. Even the case in Greek matches its feminine nouns that are matching the feminine references earlier to Great Tribulation. So the point being is that there seems to be warrant. Going back over to this slide now, there seems to be a warrant for segmenting these parts of the 70th week from beginning of sorrows up to the midpoint, and then great tribulation after the midpoint, and then we definitely have Day of the Lord using language from other parts of the Bible, such as either Old Testament or Paul's Thessalonian letters or the book of Revelation itself. We have the Day of the Lord that we can fill in for the label for that final piece of this chart here that you see where it says Day of the Lord. And so I, as a Prewrather, have heard non-Prewrathers complain or challenge this segmenting, what they call kind of artificial designations of this part of the 70th week of Daniel. But why should I consider that as artificial when Jesus creates some distinctions when he says, for then there'll be great tribulation, right? As opposed to then there'll just be tribulation. He talks about a great tribulation, and he describes the details surrounding this great tribulation. He goes on to, I might add, Jesus in Revelation chapter 7, and based on my timing, I'm probably going to have to start winding down. In Revelation chapter 7, scrolling down to starting in verse 9, John sees this great multitude of people that show up in heaven. And there's an elder that he's having a dialogue with. And when they begin to give details of this great group of people that show up in heaven, innumerable crowd, one of the details that's brought into the narrative for us is, let me scroll down to it, in verse 13, John asked the elder, or the elder actually asked John first, these who are clothed in white robes, who are they? And where have they come from? I find it interesting that the elder kind of asked a question that he already knows the answer to. And John looks at him, he's like, my Lord, you know, I don't know. What are you asking me? I'm clueless. I'm just writing the words down. I don't know where these people came from. And the elder says to John, these are the ones who come out of what? The Great Tribulation. And we have the same kind of sense of this is a definite time period. And so if read at face value, this Great Tribulation that's spoken of here in Revelation is the same Great Tribulation that Jesus spoke of in verse 21. For then there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will again, which is connected all the way back to Daniel's use of those descriptions about a time period like no other. In fact, I'll just show it to you. It's in Daniel chapter 12. Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 and 2. Now at that time, Michael, the great prince who stands guard over the sons of people, will rise. Look at Daniel's words next. And there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. You see how it's exclusive to this time period that Daniel gives the description of never has occurred since there was a nation until that time. And so this is this links it, I believe, to Yeshua's description of there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world. In other words, Yeshua is using the same theme of this is an exclusive tribulation time period that is labeled Great Tribulation. And all of that matches up with the elder saying to John, they came out of this Great Tribulation. And it's not like this word Great Tribulation is used everywhere in the Bible. In fact, I think it only shows up 3 times. There's once there in the Matthew account, and then we have it here in Revelation. But then we have another one showing up earlier in Revelation around chapter 2 or 3, where he's talking to one of the churches. I'm going to throw you into great tribulation, something like that. So back to my to this point. Beginning of sorrows, yeah, Yeshua uses those words. I don't think that's artificial if I'm borrowing the same designation that Yeshua does. The Great Tribulation, Yeshua uses that too. How can you accuse me of saying it's artificial when Yeshua gives us? But what we don't have are verses that say that the entire 7 years is the 7-year tribulation period. We don't have that language. I know someone's going to say, but wait, didn't he say tribulation earlier? And then later on in Matthew, let's see, he said immediately after the tribulation of those days. Some are going to say, but Ariel, in verse 29, isn't the word tribulation there a reference to the entire 70th week? And my answer is, where does it say that? That's a classic pre-trib and a classic post-trib position. But the Bible doesn't say that immediately after the 7-year tribulation of those days. It just says immediately after the tribulation. Now some are saying, well, you're nitpicking. Well, no. And why am I not nitpicking? Nitpicking because the immediate context of the word tribulation, where he previously used it, is just up above in verse 21. For then there will be a great tribulation. That's the last reference to a tribulation in his words here. Then when I scroll down and he says, but immediately after the tribulation of those days, I have every reason to believe he's talking still about the Great Tribulation, not the 7-year tribulation, right? I mean, I'm just reading Jesus' words at face value and taking the immediate antecedent word in the Greek from tribulation. Immediately after the that's the way we interpret all other passages. When you end up with two pronouns, we go back to the original immediate pronoun to find out if there was like a name connected, and when the pronoun seems to be ambiguous, there's like 2 he's in the passage or something, we're like, which he is referring to now? Go back to the immediate antecedent or preceding person that's mentioned, and that's probably the he in the passage. Well, the same thing's going on with the noun. The tribulation is the noun. Jesus just mentioned the Great Tribulation. So now he says in verse 29, the Great Tribulation. Or he says the tribulation seems to be the great. I could be wrong, by the way. He could mean after the 7-year tribulation of those days, right? Just like classic pre and post tribbers say. But I prefer not to, because that doesn't follow the other rules of scripture that I follow when I'm talking about immediate, preceding, antecedents, things like that. So I take verse 29 to mean immediately after the great tribulation of those days. And then that's why we see the rapture happening after the great tribulation. So drawing my study to a close in the last minute here, in example 5, I want to finish out example 5 and then stop probably example 6. Like mid-tribbers, we Prewrathers make a dramatic distinction between events in the first half of the 7 years and events in the second half of the 7 years. We find it particularly critical to eschatological discussions to disambiguate the differing uses of the popular English term tribulation. Example 5 continued. Yet, like most post-tribbers, remember I said a long time ago that we Prewrathers share features of the pre-tribbers in our model, and we also share features of the post-tribbers in our model. And I'm meaning classic on both of those. So we try to harmonize the strengths of those positions and discard the weaknesses of those two positions and come up with our own kind of synthesized version in the middle. So example 5 continued, like most post-tribbers, we Prewrathers expect to, quote, go through, end quote, what we call Antichrist's tribulation, viz. The, quote, great tribulation, end quote, right? I'm pulling those words from Jesus. I didn't make those words up. I'm not reading into the text. Jesus said great tribulation. That's what I'm going to call it too. Also, and by the way, later this week, what I'll do is I'll substantiate my position by going into Paul's writings in Thessalonians, because I can hear you guys typing away on your responses already. But Ariel, are you cherry picking in Matthew's the Olive Discourse only for your great tribulation? How about Paul's writings? How about the book of Revelation? How about the letters of 1st and 2nd Peter? Do we have great tribulation words and references there? Or do they just use tribulation? Isn't the word tribulation found throughout the entire Bible? And my answer is, with many Bible topics, there is a general kind of, what we might call, what's the word I'm looking for? A kind of maybe a broader version of that particular topic, a kind of not a subjective version, well, maybe a subjective, just a more broad use of that particular topic. Like Day of the Lord has a kind of a broad use of it and a very specific use. The word tribulation has a very broad sense use in many passages, as well as very specific use in some cases. So the point I'm trying to make is that you can't commit the fallacy where you take one word that's found in every passage in the Bible and assign one meaning to that one word, and therefore use that same meaning in every verse of the Bible that you find that meaning or even that term. That's a very poor way of reading your Bible. That absolutely falls apart at every level, but some people do it. It's a fallacy. I think it's called the word what do we call it? Word origin fallacy, or the word root fallacy, or something like that. You can do a Google search for it. The point is, don't just pick the word tribulation everywhere in the Bible and say, they're all the same thing. Therefore, that's what Jesus meant, because all the other uses of the word tribulation show up in all the other passages, and they don't mean just the Great Tribulation. They mean tribulation that we've been going through for the last 2,000 years. I know some Bible teachers who go with that position. I'm going to say, no, that's not the way I read my Bible. Every context is specific. And so context is created by, our meaning is created by the context. And so if one passage has a very minimalized version of Great Tribulation, such as a period that's marked out by a beginning and an end, then I can look at that use of the word, especially since Jesus gives it an adjective, right? He says the Great Tribulation, and he doesn't use that everywhere, and that word doesn't show up everywhere, the Great Tribulation. Even though the word tribulation shows up a lot, the specific phrase, the Great Tribulation, doesn't. So that's the point I'm trying to show you, is that, I can hear you guys typing away, Ariel, I found a verse that mentions tribulation that doesn't have anything to do with the Great Tribulation, therefore your argument falls apart. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that you're just showing that what I'm teaching is also that we need to see tribulation in a broad sense, we need to see tribulation in a narrow sense, but context tells me whether it's broad or narrow. Right? Okay. So yet, like most pre-tribbers, we pre-wrathers expect to go through what we call Antichrist tribulation, viz. The Great Tribulation. So that's the narrow use of the word indicated by Yeshua's adding the phrase the Great in front of tribulation, which definitely doesn't show up a lot of places. Like I said, I think it's only 3 times. If I remember, it could be 4, but I'm guessing 3. Also, like post-trib pre-wrath, we pre-wrathers believe, right, the hybrid model, the post-trib pre-wrath, we pre-wrathers believe we are exempted from going through God's wrath. And so that's where I'm going to stop with example number 5. We'll pick this up again next week with example number 6. So what we're doing is we're trying to disambiguate. This is the disambiguation show. I'm trying to, let me get out of my slides here and show you. I'm trying to create a topic. I want to scroll back up to this one here. I'm trying to create a topic where I'm talking about disambiguating these terms that are used in popular eschatological discussions. And we're starting out with tribulation versus wrath. We'll eventually get to rapture versus second coming, but that'll do it for eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.